Welcome to our summer online Bible study. My goal for this is as summer is crazy and we're running around everywhere and just trying to get through these crazy months, that this is a little moment that you can throw on your phone and on the drive to somewhere or mowing the yard can listen and just have another little moment where you're engaging with the Word of God. These studies aren't a sequential like our normal Bible studies are, but instead they're just kind of topical, and we're going to look at different things as kind of I see fit. So if you're on board with that, thanks for joining in. So today I want to start out by asking you a question. All right, let's play the hypothetical game. Let's just imagine, if you will. Let's pretend that an alien from another planet showed up. Right? They showed up and they meet you first for the you're the first human they've ever met. They don't know anything about the planet. They haven't studied it from afar for you or whatever. Like you are their first encounter with the planet Earth. And they ask you, hey, tell me about the planet. What's Earth like? What is humanity like? You'd probably go through and depending on your how pessimistic or optimistic you are, you probably would start with something along the lines of how much humanity has to offer, right? Like you would say the good things. You would talk about how beautiful the planet is, how it has all this wonderful potential. You talk about all the incredible things humanity's been able to achieve. But eventually, you'd have to kind of come clean about the dark stuff, right? Like, you'd have to start sharing, well, humanity also has a massive propensity to be cruel, right? That humanity loves to take advantage of itself, how people are abused and neglected and hurt, all for the sake of people's selfishness. That there are kids who are raised in unfair environments. There are kids who are starving to death because of other people's greed. That there are people who are abused, that are neglected. Like there's all these horrible things that happen. We kill each other. We torture each other. That humanity can be just downright evil. We don't take care of the planet the way we should. That all the beauty that you described, you'd probably have to say, yeah, but we're also kind of ruining it in a lot of places. Like you'd have to say or talk about how big a mess the planet is essentially at some point. And then, because you're a Christian, you'd want to tell them about the God of the universe, right? You'd want to tell them about the God that created this planet. And you'd say things like this God is a good God, that he loves humanity and that he put on flesh and he came and he died for us, and that he's omniscient, right? He's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's omnipotent. I said those backwards, but you get the point, right? Like this is a God who nothing can stop him. If he sets out to do something, it will be done. Now, at the end of that conversation, this imaginary alien will be left with two conclusions. That either one, that omniscient, powerful God doesn't exist, or two, that he's not a good God, right? Like those are the conclusions that he would have to be left with. That if you look at how messed up the earth is, about how evil humanity can be, and yet there's this deity out there that could do something about it, but seemingly doesn't. You're left with that perspective that if that God's real, they probably don't want anything to do with him. That's the perspective that a growing number of people in our country and around the world have. That they're not necessarily anti-spiritual, they're not necessarily atheist, but that if there is a God, that they don't really want anything to do with him. They look at how messy the world is, about how complicated things, about how cruel people are, about how much humanity messes things up, about how broken this place is. And they can't reconcile that with the God who supposedly could do something about it. And the sad part is a lot of preachers never address this. Like they never touch this because it's a difficult subject to deal with, and it's not something that you can just preach and say, here's the answer, ta-da, and like everybody's going to be good with it. No, like the humanity's capacity for evil is almost limitless. And to reconcile that with a God that could do something about it but seemingly doesn't, it takes more than just one mental exercise. It takes a lot of thinking and dwelling and processing. And so it's not something that's easily preached either. But on the other hand, you may not know that the Bible deals with this directly. That the Bible actually teaches that, yes, that there is brokenness in this world, but there's also a God who's doing something about it. And it's why I love the book of Philemon. Because Philemon, it goes, it zooms in, right? Like you look at most of the New Testament, most of the Old Testament, and we're dealing with things at a national level with the nation of Israel, or a people level with the people of God, or even like a universal level with God restoring creation that's broken. Like it's big, right? You're zoomed way out most of the time. But with the book of Philemon, you're zoomed really far in. You're dealing with one specific situation where real life happened in real people's lives in a real way. It was a perfectly normal situation, but it shows how God does intervene in the cruelty of humanity. We're going to be dealing with issues of slavery. We're going to be dealing with issues of politics. We're going to be dealing with issues of theft and betrayal. All the things that make humanity so messy are dealt with in this itty-bitty letter called Philemon. See, the main character in this letter is not Philemon himself. You may not realize Philemon was a dude's name, but that's a dude's name. It's a guy who's wealthy. He's a householder. He's a guy who has property, and he's wealthy, and so that means he has slaves, right? And we're not talking about Western slavery in 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century slavery. It's a very different kind of slavery. Again, not justifying it either, right? I'm not saying slavery ever is a good thing. But slavery in the Roman Empire was essentially, it was viewed more like electricity is today. The world would not operate without it. So for slavery to go away was almost inconceivable. It would be like saying, hey, we're going to stop using electricity now. Everything would collapse. That was basically the way slavery functioned in the Roman world. Up to a third of the empire were actually slaves, and most slaves were just, it was a financial was the reason they got into it. It was either they were on the losing side of a battle and they were taken as slaves, or financially they were in ruin and their only option was to go into slavery. I mean, it's very common throughout the record that you see like somebody's farm fails a year and the parents sell a kid into slavery. I'm, again, not justifying it. It's just what happened. And so how our main character Onesimus becomes a slave, we don't know. The only thing we do know is that it wasn't racial. It wasn't because of the color of his skin, the way we typically think of slavery in this country. His parents could have had financial problems. His parents could have been on the wrong side of a battle. He could have been on the wrong side of a battle. He could have been in financial issues and sold himself into slavery. All of these things were regular occurrences. So we look at Onesimus and we see somebody who yearns for something more, though, right? See, Onesimus worked for Philemon as a slave in his household, and at some point he sees an opportunity to run. And before he runs, he steals from his master. He steals from the guy who owns him. Now, for Onesimus to do this, that was a death penalty, essentially, in most cases. Not always. There were some cases where the owner would recapture the slave and then would brand them with a letter to signify this person was a slave for life. There was no escaping that for them. But most of the time, this was a death penalty, to not only run away, but to steal. This was something that Onesimus was spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, essentially. But after Onesimus leaves, he makes his way into the person. He makes his way into the presence of Paul the Apostle, somebody who knows a thing or two about violence and having to look over his shoulder. And through Paul, he becomes a Christian. He hears the story of Jesus about how God has chosen to free people from the slavery to sin and to the brokenness of this world through his son Jesus. And Onesimus gels with that. And he becomes redeemed. He becomes part of the faith. He becomes part of the family. Simultaneously, maybe before, maybe after, we don't know. But at some point, Philemon becomes a Christian as well. They both end up worshiping the same God, believing in the same Jesus. And at that point, a wrong has to be made right. Right? This is where things get tricky, because as a Christian, if you did wrong to somebody, you have to make that right. You can't just let it go. I mean, I'm not saying every situation has to look exactly like this. Like, there's a whole lot of other variables that go into every situation. But essentially, Onesimus wronged Philemon, even though Philemon had wronged Onesimus by owning him. He had to make it right. And so the letter of Philemon is Paul's appeal on behalf of Onesimus to Philemon to say, hey, this man is a brother now, and he is going to come back to you. He's going to come back to the city of Colossae, where you live, where you're at. He's probably the one bringing the letter of Colossians that we have. But you're going to have to do something about this. And Paul tells Philemon, you have to welcome him as a brother. He doesn't tell him he has to set him free. I mean, essentially, legally, Philemon is still a slave at this point. But he has to welcome him as a brother. And that's a huge ask, right? That's a whole lot of rubber meets the road. That's a whole lot of, do you really believe what you say you believe in Jesus? Do you really believe in the God who loves everybody universally, who shows mercy to those who don't deserve it, shows grace to those who don't deserve it, that we are supposed to love one another as Christ loves us, master and slave even? Do you believe that? Now, we don't have the conclusion. We don't know exactly what happened. There's a lot of traditions that have been passed down through the centuries, so it's really anybody's guess what happened. But I think that there was reconciliation. I think that they ended up finding a way to live at peace with one another, to love one another with the love of Christ. See, here's the thing about Jesus, is he takes that brokenness of this world and he took it on himself. Like we typically kind of skip over this part. We don't dwell on it other than maybe to glorify or try to make it real how much Jesus suffered. But we miss out on the fact that Jesus, this God incarnate, Son of God, came here specifically for people who would kill him, right? Specifically for those of us who would reject him, turn our backs on him, betray him. Every one of us who sin, that's what we're doing. He came here for us, knowing that all those horrible things we would do would happen, and he took all that on himself. And he lived a life where he had to deal with the things that you and I deal with. He had to deal with relationships with people who thought he was wrong, people who rejected him, people who were cruel to him. He had to deal with all of those things, and yet he didn't fall like we did. He didn't mess it up like we did. He didn't participate like we do. And he suffered because of it. He suffered brutally because of it. That's why we read in 2 Corinthians 5:21, the Messiah did not know sin, but God made him to be sin on our behalf, so that in him we might embody God's faithfulness to the covenant. We see that Jesus took on all the suffering. He took on all the pain, all the cruelty, all the abuse, all the neglect, all the greed. He took all of that on himself. He experienced it on our behalf to save us. And Jesus offers us freedom from it in return. Yes, until Judgment Day, we have to deal with the sinful world around us, the sinful environment. And that has an effect on us. And that's why we see people suffering who don't deserve to suffer, who did nothing to earn that suffering. Kids. That's why we see it, because we still live in a world where sin corrupts the very matter of this universe. But Jesus has said that when he returns again, he's going to deal with it all. And that leads us back to our initial question. Is God cruel if he exists at all? Does he care? Does he understand? Or is he just up there watching us, just taking in the show? Is that what he's doing? I'm a firm believer in letting people who said it best say it themselves. And so I want to finish out our Bible study by reading this, I don't know what you call it, note, letter, essay on Good Friday by a guy named John Mark McMillan. And the whole premise of it is, why do we call it Good Friday? The day that Jesus was brutally executed. Why do we call it good? And it says it better than I ever could. So I'm just going to finish out by reading this to you. He says, it's often puzzled me why anyone would describe the day that God died as good. Okay, maybe for my theological purists in the room, let's say God didn't exactly die, just his perfect, innocent, beautiful lamb of a human self-expression on earth. Splitting hairs, if you ask me, but thanks for keeping us in line. Also, thanks for making it seem even less good. I digress. But even applying the most transactional interpretations of Scripture, the day the rent comes due has never felt like a good one, even if you live on 60 acres by the sea. So, good. I'd like to make an observation. I'm an avid fan of all types of fiction, and over the years I've noticed that it's never the strength of a character that endears me to my favorites. Laser eyes, X-ray vision, and flight make Superman exciting, but not interesting. The real reason popular culture has obsessed over him since 1938 isn't because he's strong, nope. It's because of his great weakness, Lois Lane. See, his powers perpetually place the person he loves in jeopardy, and that makes him weak. It also makes him believable, accessible, and even lovable. Maybe it's our yellow sun that gives Kal-El his abilities, but Lois is the only reason any of us give a darn about him almost a century after his introduction. She's his kryptonite. See what I did there? And she's always been his only real superpower. Because it's his weakness that gives us access to him. His weakness is the door into his story. Otherwise, he's just a program running in the background as inhuman as the elements themselves, and we're ants in his arboretum. Without Lois, Superman is dead on the page. Do you see where I'm going with this? God has been alive, active, and powerful for eons, even before eternity itself. But on Good Friday, God didn't just die. It was also the moment he began to actually, in one sense, truly exist. The moment God died the way we die, all of a sudden he could be alive in the way that actually mattered to a cosmic bugs like you and me. No longer just a pagan-style tit-for-tat, means-to-an-end, little g God, but an actual companion through the great mysteries of this painful life. If there's any confusion here, let me shoot straight. I have little use for an all-powerful deity who chooses to experience the brutality of this world from a box seat with a bag of chips and a Coke. I just don't know how to justify the God who'd force me to watch my sweetest Aunt Barbara die of cancer, my joyful, boisterous friend Larry painfully waste away in a hospital bed, or allow me to have so many wordless conversations with people I love who live with the ghosts of their lost children. There's almost zero chance I can have a meaningful relationship with a God like that. Sure, I can bend the knee and say the magic words. I can sign on the dotted line. I can pray. I can serve. Maybe this God could even be my Lord, but not my Savior, because we could never be friends unless there would be one who is willing to step down from the stars, descend the stairs of his penthouse, and fellowship with our sufferings. I can love a God like that because while I can only make deals with one who heals, I can actually give my heart to one who feels my wounds. And this is what I truly believe. God must be all-powerful expressly because he also must bear the weight of all the suffering that has ever transpired. I'm sure this makes him both the most joyful and sorrowful being in the multiverse. The God who hangs between the earth and sky, taking responsibility for all of it, the whole darned thing. Our successes and failures, pain and elation, honor and humiliation, love and loss. Absorbing it into his God flesh right there at the intersection of all things, appropriately upon a cross. Certainly, this is he who has always been. God has always loved us, but in Jesus, the strength of his weakness, we can now fully love him back. And maybe it's why the ugliest of days is also good, because Jesus redeemed the whole world on Sunday, but on Friday, he kind of redeemed God. I hope this Bible study helps you answer that big question, helps you in your process of reconciling the suffering we see in this world around us with an all-powerful God, that you can start to see that he did do something about it, that he is doing something about it, that he's not just up there silently watching, taking in the show, but instead he's bearing the weight of it all. I hope this study helped you, and if you have any questions, as always, reach out. We'll see you next time.